And thank you very much. And I would very much like to thank Stephen for organising this. He really deserves a round of applause. Because when you think of it, there's nothing more important than health. Doesn't matter how much money you've got, doesn't matter how many possessions you've got, it means nothing if you don't have health. So let's talk about health. And what I want to talk about is the global epidemic of non-communicable chronic diseases. The World Health Organization recognizes this as the leading cause of death around the world. The thing is about these diseases, and these are diseases such as heart disease, stroke, cancer, we can't get them because we're sitting next to a person with them. You're not going to get cancer because you're sitting next to a person with cancer. These are diseases that we know come from lifestyle and environment. That's actually good news because that means we can prevent them by changing our lifestyle. That's one of the things that's very important about this conference. We know that food is a very important part of this epidemic. But we also know environmental exposures are. And the ones which are most underreported but have a big role in this epidemic: radiation, which we've heard about from speakers, but also chemicals and pesticides. The issue of chemicals and pesticides is largely ignored when we look at this epidemic, even though we have a lot of science to show their role. The reason why it's largely ignored is because our authorities will say all the pesticides, all the chemicals have been analysed by good science and they are safe. Trust us, they are safe. Well, let's look at this science. Well, the truth is, now there's actually more than 100,000 chemicals since I wrote my book. You get more and more all the time, and less than 1% are actually scientifically tested. The vast majority of chemicals we are exposed to have zero scientific testing. New chemicals are made every day and put out there in the environment. They turn out also in our bodies with zero scientific information. Pesticides are one of the few groups of chemicals where there is some testing. So let's look at it. When a farmer uses a pesticide, it is a formulation. It is a cocktail of different ingredients. One they call the active ingredient, the others they call inerts. These inerts aren't inert, they're added because they make the active ingredient work more effectively. Some of them are solvents, others are adjuvants. They have a range of roles, but when the company, the pesticide company, submits the pesticide for testing, they only have to nominate one of these ingredients. And usually, that one ingredient is less than 5% of the mixture. A lot of times it's less than 1% of the mixture. And yet there is an assumption that just by testing this one ingredient, that the toxicity of this one ingredient is the same as the toxicity of the cocktail of ingredients that is sprayed on our food. That is what we call a data-free assumption. In other words, there's no evidence, scientific evidence, to show that this mixture has the same toxicology as the one ingredient they choose. It's a scientific nonsense. And where we do have independent testing in the peer-reviewed literature, and the peer-reviewed literature is the gold standard in science, these chemicals are usually hundreds of percent more toxic. Some of these formulations, and the reason I keep on calling these formulations, these are the actual products used by farmers, not just the one ingredient that is tested. It's the actual product. So sometimes they test the actual product for acute toxicity. This means the amount of chemical that once you're exposed to, you will die within 2 weeks. In other words, if you have an exposure and in that time you die, then that is recorded or looked at, and they work out the safety rate. That's very good to prevent people from dying from it, but it tells you nothing about long-term diseases. Cancer takes more than 2 weeks. Heart diseases take more than 2 weeks. Stroke takes more than 2 weeks. Birth defects take more than 2 weeks. Here in the United States, there's about 1,400 of these formulations that are registered. My country, which actually has one of the worst regulatory authorities, we have 7,200 chemicals that are registered. And not one. There is no testing for reproductive effects, for birth defects, for cancer, for all the chronic diseases we see in our society. So the reality is this: there are thousands of formulated pesticides that are used in the production of our food, and not one has been scientifically tested for the actual long-term chronic diseases that we suffer from, which is an epidemic. So that's why I termed, my first book was called The Myths of Safe Pesticides, to show that this safety of pesticides is a myth. In the scientific literature, the peer-reviewed scientific literature, there is only one published study that looks at what happens to a lifetime exposure to the actual levels of pesticides we find in our body. One by Professor Seralini. Oh boy, it didn't like me. Oh, okay. I thought I had a world mic. Is this better now if I speak? Okay. Sorry, I assumed that the lapel mic was working, so okay, I'll use this one instead. So I'll repeat myself again. In the scientific literature, in the independent scientific literature, there is only one study that looks at a lifetime exposure to a formulated pesticide at the actual levels we are exposed to. In this case, it's parts per billion. It's about 1,000 times less than is permitted as safe by our regulatory authorities. And what it showed is that the exposed animals, all of them, all the female animals developed mammary tumours, except for one that had an ovarian tumour. They all had various degrees of kidney damage and liver damage. And I think what's really important about this study is that the particular rat they used is used by toxicologists because it's a very good model for human exposure. That's why it's used. This actual study was actually based on an earlier study by Monsanto, the maker of Roundup. And in this case, they did a 90-day study, but Professor Seralini looked at the 90-day study, and while Monsanto said there was no problems with it, he could see major problems and wrote up a paper showing that Monsanto had not analysed the data, and in 90 days could see problems. But he went and replicated the study, but instead of doing it for 90 days, decided to do it for 2 years, which is the lifetime of a rat. And after the 90-day period, that's when they started to see all the problems. The difference between the controls, and the controls are the ones who did not get the glyphosate, and the animals that did get the glyphosate. In this study also, they looked at the GMO and the combination of the GMO and Roundup. All three caused mammary tumours and other tumours in the animals and substantial damage to various tissues of the body compared to the animals that were not controlled. And this is a really important issue here. So here we can look at the slides and see, and there they show the areas of damage to different tissues. And I think what's really important about this is, I'll say again, this is the levels that most of us here will have in our blood and urine systems, because Roundup is like the new DDT. It's everywhere. It's in water, it's in food. Nearly everybody who's tested has Roundup. And of great concern is it's in breast milk, and we know it crosses the placenta. It's affecting our babies before they're born and after they're born. This study alarmed the pesticide industry so much, and especially Monsanto. They did everything possible to denigrate it. They actually forced it to go through what's called a second peer review. And to explain peer review, this is the gold standard in science. This is where a study is written up by the researchers, and then other independent experts look at it and check it for accuracy. Then it gets published in a recognized scientific journal. Monsanto did everything possible to try and get this study taken off, so they did a second peer review, and that came up that this study is a good study, but still Monsanto played dirty tricks and got it pulled out of the journal, got it retracted. However, it went through a third peer reviewed and got published in a second journal. So this particular study has been peer reviewed 3 times, which makes it one of the most rigorous study ever published. You hear people say, oh, this study, it uses a rat that just gets cancer. Well, Monsanto used exactly the same rat in its study. Why? Because it is a very good model for cancer in humans. And the difference is between the ones that did not get the Roundup and the ones that did get the Roundup. And you compare the difference. And the ones that did get the Roundup, substantially more cancers. In fact, in the case of the female rats, all of them had tumours, all of the treated ones. So this study, for me, should have been a wake-up call. At the moment, they're trying to debunk it again by doing another set of studies on lifetime exposure to Roundup. But guess what? They're using a different rat. This is a rat we know does not get cancer. So the outcome will be there'll be no cancers. And then they will say, our studies show that Roundup is safe, it doesn't get cancers. But it is not the same study. If you use a study with a rat that is proven not to get cancer, it proves nothing. You need a rat model that gets cancer in the same way as humans. And that is the warning about this study. So there we're talking about just one formulated pesticide. Out of the thousands, we have one study of lifetime exposure. But the reality is, when pesticides are approved, they don't approve just one pesticide to be used in a crop. They approve multiple pesticides. So they'll be insecticides, fungicides, herbicides. For those of you who are listening to Philip before, and he's talking about the apple orchards in the Tyrol in Italy, and they're using up to 35 pesticides. And believe me, in horticulture, in fresh fruit and vegetable production around the world, that is fairly typical. Consequently, all the research shows that most foods and most people have multiple pesticide residues. And there's no requirement for testing these combinations. There's an assumption that there's no change in toxicity between the combination of pesticides and the individual pesticides, which is a nonsense. Where we have peer-reviewed science done by independent researchers, not by the pesticide companies, by independent scientists and researchers, we know that these combinations are usually more than just being additive. Common sense would say if you add two chemicals together, you increase the toxicity. That's being additive. But many of them are synergistic. What synergistic means, instead of being additive, 1 and 1 equals 2, the effect is stronger. 1 and 1 equals 3, 4, 5. And we have very good papers showing that in some cases 1 and 1 can equal 100 or even 1,000 times more toxic. I think what is of great concern here is research here in the United States shows that babies are being born with up to 232 chemicals in the placental cord blood. In other words, these chemicals are crossing the placenta and affecting the unborn baby. We have no science as to what it means. But the science we do have, and I'll talk more about it, shows that this is not good news, that we do know we're doing harm to our children before they are even born. The other one we hear, oh yes, there's lots of chemicals. Yes, there are residues, but the amounts are too small to cause any problems. So let's look at this science and deconstruct it. Many chemicals that they will say are safe in parts per million, when they start going down to smaller levels, parts per billion and parts per trillion, start acting like hormones. And they can disrupt our hormone system, our endocrine system. They're called endocrine disruptors. And the science shows that, parts per billion and parts per trillion can cause great damage, particularly to the developing fetus. What is a part per trillion? That is one drop of water in 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water. I want you to imagine how small that is. But we know with research looking at how the fetus develops is that chemicals in parts per trillion act like hormones. And what these small amounts of hormones do is activate the genes at particular times to start developing the fetus. So the signal to say, now is the time to make eyes or fingers or the brain or our reproductive system or our metabolic system. And if those signals are interfered with, it affects the development of the child. These are known as programming events. And in many cases, they can't be unprogrammed. The child will develop with these problems for the rest of their life. The issue here is that many of these chemicals are approved based on work at parts per million with zero science looking at what actually happens at parts per billion and parts per trillion when they can act as hormones. The fact is, according to the World Health Organization, we have over 800 chemicals that act in this way. And just to explain, the graph up there is the standard model used by our regulatory authorities. It's based on a scientific concept that's more than 400 years old. The dose makes the poison. In other words, what they're trying to say, as you go lower in dose, the toxicity goes lower, and if you get down low enough, it's no longer toxic. It no longer causes any problems. And that's what they work on. However, the new science shows that there are many chemicals. The World Health Organization recognizes over 800 of them, that you get down to a certain low level, and as you get lower, the toxic effect, the damage effect increases. It's called a non-monotonic dose. And this is recognized in the 1990s, and for instance here the US EPA in the 1990s was supposed to act on this, and other regulatory agencies, and as yet not one of the 800 known chemicals has been banned based on this. It's been neglected. But we know these chemicals are causing massive problems. For instance, a lot of them will act like artificial estrogens, and they're strongly implicated in the epidemic of cancers of sexual tissues. And this is breast, ovarian, cervical, endometrial, prostate, and testicular cancers, but also in the reproductive problems. Things like endometriosis now, which is a major silent epidemic that's just starting to get the attention it deserves. All of us probably have friends who suffer from endometriosis. Ovarian insufficiency, falling sperm counts, normal sperm, and then urinary genital defects in young children, particularly young boys. And we know in some cases this is due to grandparents' exposure. So the other myth we hear is that the modern chemicals aren't like the bad ones. When Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, they said, and and they banned DDT. They said the problem with DDT was that it's very residual, long-lasting. The new chemicals aren't residual, they aren't long-lasting, they don't leave residues. Well, if that was the case, if they didn't leave residues, why do we need maximum residue levels for them? Because they leave residues. But, you know, and we have to have acceptable daily intakes for them because they're all through our food. And the testing shows most foods and most people have multiple residues. The other thing they say, oh, look, these chemicals, you know, they break down very quickly. And so the assumption is once they break down, they go away, they disappear into nothing. And we can all live happily ever after. They sort of neglect to mention that most of them, when they break down, they actually become more dangerous. So the organophosphates, for instance, and the neonicotinoids, which are the two most common groups of pesticides that are used, when they break down, they are usually 100% to 300% more toxic. In other words, yes, they break down, now they are even worse. And, you know, the most common group now, the neonicotinoids, the ones that are implicated in killing bees, in Europe they're banning them for bees, or each time they ban one, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. The pesticide companies changed the chemistry a bit, slightly, put a new name on it and put out two new ones, but they're essentially the same chemistry. But when they break down these neonicotinoids, we know now they're particularly dangerous, particularly for children, and they can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause major damage to the developing brain. And I'll talk more about that because I think this is a huge issue amongst all the different issues. But what is very important is that we know that most of these chemicals form these metabolites. We know actually they're more residual than the actual chemical, and yet there's very little testing for it. And yet where independent testing is done, we can find these residues in our food, in our bodies, and in our urine. So let's talk about the people who assure us it's safe. They're doing a wonderful job looking after us. They're using great science. Our pesticide regulatory bodies, such as the EPA here in the States. We'll talk about the actual process. I talked about the gold standard in science, which is peer-reviewed science. Peer-reviewed science is where a researcher without conflicts of interest, or they openly declare their conflicts of interest, publish a paper, and other scientists independently, and this is a blind process, the researchers don't know these other experts, they look at the paper and check it for accuracy. Once it's all revised, it's published in a reputable scientific journal, so all of us can look at it, read it, understand it, and decide whether, you know, we agree with it. But this is an open and transparent process based on good science, the gold standard. This gold standard is largely ignored by the regulatory authorities because they instead get their studies from the pesticide industry, not from independent scientists. So the pesticide industry does the studies and decides which ones it will submit. Are they going to submit the ones that will damage their case? No. They will submit the ones that make their products look good. But If we want to look at these studies and actually have a look at the science, we can't, because they are commercial in confidence. We, the people who have to eat these pesticides and feed them to our children, should have the right to look at the studies our authorities are using, and we should have the right to have other experts look at it, but we can't. This process is totally hidden. We also know there's a revolving door. I don't know how many people listened to Jeffrey Smith yesterday talking about GMOs, but it's the same with pesticides. The people from the pesticide industry end up getting jobs as managers in the regulatory bodies, and they're the ones who make the decisions. And on top of that, the actual committees that sit down and review these studies submitted by the pesticide industry have people who receive money from these same pesticide industries. This is a conflict of interest, or what many of us would call a totally corrupt process. It is the equivalent of the foxes running the hen house. And what I want to say here is that where we get these studies, they're either not good enough to be peer-reviewed, or when we look at them and have independent toxicologists look at them, we usually find more evidence of harm, not less. We need to change this so that it is an open and transparent process based on good science. But at this stage, I will say clearly that there is not one decision by one regulatory agency, government regulatory agency on this planet, that we can trust. The only one that I'm prepared to trust, because it is open, is the World Health Organization, and I'll talk more about that. So let's talk about what I regard as probably one of the biggest crimes, is the fact that our children are being poisoned by pesticides, and this is being ignored. The fetus, the newborn and growing children, do not have the same protective liver enzymes that adults have. As adults, we have enzymes that can break down poisons. In other words, if we have a few drinks of alcohol, most of us have the enzymes that can break it down. There's some people who can't, and they can die very quickly from alcohol. But most toxins, we can break them down because our liver has the ability to put out enzymes. But the developing fetus and the newborn do not have these enzymes. And that means they have no ability to break down any toxic pesticides. The peer-reviewed science shows that the smallest amounts of pesticides do serious damage to children. And in the literature, what we'll see that pesticides cause in children: lower IQs, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, the autism spectrum, cancers, organ damage, autoimmune diseases, lack of physical coordination, loss of temper, anger management, the whole bipolar, schizophrenia spectrum, depression and youth suicide, and also childhood obesity, because we know it's not just junk food, it's actually the way the metabolic systems are being changed, and they don't have the ability to burn the sugars. Their bodies convert them into fat straight away and start to store it rather than actually burning them. It's a major issue that we are understanding is caused by the endocrine disruption effect of these chemicals. This is a peer-reviewed paper that I'm one of the authors of. And we looked at 22 diseases here in the USA and correlated it to the increase in glyphosate and GMOs. And this one I want to show you because this is the increase in autism. Now, the yellow bars are the number of children being diagnosed with autism in the USA. The red line is the increase in the use of glyphosate or Roundup. If you look at the bottom of the bar, you can see there's not a lot of autism and not a lot of Roundup used. And then in the mid-1990s, that changes. Why? Because that's when Roundup-ready GMOs were introduced, and then it skyrockets. When we published this, the industry couldn't attack us on our data because it was very good. We got that from the US government, and our analyses were good. What they would say is that correlation is not causation. And they're right. You know, it could be by accident that you could get an increase of sales of cell phones in Finland, and it tracks much the same. In fact, what they tried to do to debunk us is put out another graph showing how the increase of sales of organic foods in the USA mirrored this increase in diseases. So correlation is not causation. Things can be an accident that they look similar. However, there's a tool that we use in statistics called a Pearson's correlation coefficient. I don't expect you to ever remember that. But what it is, it's a way that we can look at the probability that these two graphs are linked. And in this case, I'll say the probability that Roundup is not the cause, is not linked to this epidemic of autism, is 1 in 10,000. Now, correlation studies are very useful for understanding if there is a problem. Now, for instance, if we had published this link to autism and we looked at a medication, a drug that's on the market, with this level of correlation, it would have been taken off the market, and they would have used the precautionary principle to look at, well, is this the case? Is this drug causing all these side effect of autism? But we're lucky Roundup is not a drug. It's only a poisonous pesticide, so there's no need to take it off the market, no need to get it out of our bodies and out of our food. That's the attitude of the regulatory authorities. Anyway, the year after we publish, a very good study comes out showing exactly how glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, causes this disease. Now, can you turn up the lapel mic? Because I just want to use the pointer. Maybe I'll just have to walk on and off. I just want to show you, point out different parts of these diagrams. These are nerve cells that are exposed to small amounts of glyphosate as they are developing. One is the control, that's the one without glyphosate, and the other is with a very small amount of glyphosate. And I want to point out the yellow line that looks like a lightning strike. That's called the axon. As the nerve develops, you can see the axon, it starts getting more complex. It's getting what we call branches. It's branching out. Each of those branches are important because that's how it communicates with other nerve cells. We look at the next division of the one treated with glyphosate, and it's just starting to get a simple axon. Here, probably, I don't know if you can see it well enough, probably not enough contrast, but what you should see, it looks like a massive lightning strike or tree roots. Lots and lots of branches, and this one has hardly got any branches. The more branches a nerve cell's got, it means the more other connections it can make. And this is very important. This is very important for our brains. The more connections that are in the brain, the bigger what we now know as a neural network is. The less connections means the brain is not working properly. It is undeveloped. The glyphosate nerves are undeveloped. They are not connecting. Connections are missing within the brain. The best way to think of it is like a computer and wires are cut. And it's not working properly. This is what glyphosate is doing. Our brain is our biggest collection of nerve cells. And what is happening here is because we know this crosses the placenta and affects the developing fetus and also young children. That means as their brains are growing, the nerves are being damaged and not making the connections. And this is why we're seeing issues like autism, ADHD, and a whole range of other behavioural problems. I would argue that study alone is enough for glyphosate to be banned. Enough. And what's really important, thank you, I really appreciate that. What is really important here is that here they look at the actual biochemical pathway, how it affects the specific genes that give the signals to develop nerves. So this is very sound science. Why it's ignored to me is criminal. I'll call ignoring this child abuse. Okay, another issue, another epidemic, cancer. It touches all of us. And one of my favourite studies, one that's been totally ignored, came out in 2010. The President Obama is the US President's Cancer Panel study. And this study is done by more than 30 of the world's best cancer specialists. And they looked at hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers. And what's really important here is that this idea that, cancers are bad, like it's in your genes, that's not true. 80% of cancers are due to environmental toxins, especially chemicals and pesticides. The other environmental toxin, which they acknowledged, is radiation. And I think it's good that we've got speakers here today talking about the issue of cell phone radiation. It's something that we really need to deal with. But still, they say that chemicals and especially pesticides are the main causes. They give really good evidence how this epidemic in childhood cancers are caused by pesticides. And what I want to show here is, that was 2010, nothing's done about it. You get the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research into Cancer, and they find that we still have a growing epidemic in childhood cancers. It's not going backwards, it's going up. and not being recognised or acted upon. But all cancers are going up, or most of them. And particularly, we know that with this increase in cancers, that for most of the world, the mortality, the death rate is going up. Now, some cancers, such as breast cancer, the rates of breast cancer are still going up, but if you're lucky enough to live here in the US or in Europe, the rates of mortality are going down because of treatment. But if you live in the rest of the world, the number of women dying of these cancers is still going up because they don't have the medical facilities that those of us that live in advanced developed countries have. So this is a cruel epidemic that is still on the rise. I just want to show you this. This is here in the United States, part of the same study, and this is looking at thyroid cancer. And I chose this because thyroid cancer is one of the cancers that the World Health Organization looked at when they did their report on glyphosate, and we'll talk more about it. But once again, the yellow bars are the number of people who are being diagnosed with thyroid cancer. I want you to look at the green line. We'll go back to the 1970s here. And the green line is the trend rate, pre-1990s. And what you could see was thyroid cancer, the levels of diagnosis were fairly steady, just going up and down a little bit, but they were level. And then in the mid-1990s, it skyrockets. And the red line is the increase in Roundup and glyphosate. And the blue one is the increase in the growth of GMOs, Roundup-ready GMOs, because they're related. The increase in glyphosate is due to the increase in Roundup-ready GMOs. And once again, when we did our probability analysis, it's a 1 in 10,000 chance that they are not linked, that it is an accident. A year after we published that, the World Health Organization published its study showing or classifying Roundup or glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, as the second highest level of being carcinogenic. And I need to explain that because what people hear, oh, it's probably carcinogenic. They said it's probably carcinogenic to humans. What this level 2A means, it is definitely carcinogenic in animal studies. In this case, they found that it causes cancer in rats, mice, and dogs. And there's a range of cancers, including what I wanted to show you was thyroid cancer. There is limited evidence of it causing cancer in humans, and this is non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is where at the moment, according to Jeffrey Smith yesterday, the amount of people suing Monsanto Bayer is up to 45,000 now for getting it. Yeah, and let's... Thank you. And I'd like to also say, I hope this is the start of more court cases for more pesticides too, that hurt them where it really hit them where it really hurts. So, look, I just explained again that the highest level for a carcinogen is type 1, and that's where we have lots of evidence in humans. So, for instance, asbestos. Of course, it's still not banned here in the US, but it's banned in most other countries in the world. Smoking, drinking alcohol, benzene. There's a whole range of these compounds that we know definitely cause cancers in humans. When they did this review, a lot of the toxicologists wanted to give Roundup the highest level of causing cancer, but there's this sort of argument, so knocked it down a notch. But what I'd like to say is when you see studies that something causes multiple cancers in multiple animals, you can bet your bottom dollar that it causes cancer in humans, because believe it or not, we are animals as well. So somehow something's going to cause cancer in animals but not in us is an absolutely ridiculous idea. Yes, this thing causes cancer. It's clear. So what I want to end on now is not just cancer, but something that we're doing to our children through pesticides that is unforgivable. The research shows that a whole range of pesticides damages the normal development of nerve cells, the nervous system in children. So I showed you the pictures of how glyphosate does that. Many of the pesticides were developed originally not as pesticides, but as nerve poisons in warfare, such as the organophosphates. And we know that whole groups of them, organophosphates, carbamates, pyrethroids, and neonicotinoids, all damage the nervous system. And the brain is our largest collection of nerve cells. What the science shows is that the smallest amount of these chemicals cause negative effects on the development of the brain, and particularly in children. This is an example of a study done in Mexico with two groups of children. One group of children lived in a farming area in a valley where they were subject to pesticide drift. The other group lived higher in the mountains, actually lived in traditional villages and didn't use pesticides. These are 4-year-old girls, 4.5-year-old girls, and they're asked to draw pictures of people. And if you look at one lot of pictures, you can see they're drawing the sort of pictures that all of us as parents or grandparents just love, little children drawing, and you've probably still got these pictures around our houses. That's what we'd expect them to draw. But look at the other girls, they're the same age. They can't draw anything remotely like a person. That's brain damage. When that was put out, the pesticide people said, that's anecdotal, that's not real science. How do you know it's pesticides? It could be this, that. Make up all the excuses to ignore it. But since then, there are lots of other studies that look at what happens when the fetus is exposed to the smallest amounts of pesticides. In this case, it is not because they live in a farming community, but it's the residues in the food that mum ate when she was pregnant. And these residues cross the placental barrier and affect the development of children. And the results show that this causes a lowering of the IQ of children. One study actually tried to find the smallest safe level and couldn't. In other words, the smallest amounts cause damage, and we have no evidence of safety for any amount. And I want to say this again, and I say it at every place I speak. At this stage, there is not one peer-reviewed scientific paper showing the safety of one pesticide for children. Not one. There's no evidence. And I'm waiting for the day I'm proved wrong. because that would be good news. At least we know one pesticide at a certain level is safe. But at this stage, there's no evidence that any of them are safe. And the evidence shows that the smallest amounts cause damage. And what I want to get across here is most people are not farmers. They get their pesticides from the food they eat. And these levels and residues of pesticides are the ones which our regulatory authorities, like the FDA, like the US EPA, say is safe. We now have very good scientific techniques of actually analysing the damage done by pesticides. In the past, they would feed the animals, destroy them, and then look at their body parts under a microscope. We don't need to do that now because we have non-invasive technologies like MRI scans. The excuse for not looking at where the pesticides could affect children is the fact that, as much as it was actually proposed by some people in pesticide companies, it is unethical to feed children, kill them, and then start looking at their bodies under microscopes, thankfully. But then they'd say, oh, well, we can't do that, so we got no evidence. We can't get any evidence, so everything's okay. It's the ostrich with their head in the sand, If we don't see any danger, there is no danger. But we do have technologies where we can look inside the human body or any body, not harm them, and see the damage. And I want to show you this. These are MRI scans of the brains of children who were affected by pesticides when their mother was pregnant with them. Their mom ate the normal American diet. Now, what I want to show you here is that the greater the pesticide exposure, the greater the brain damage. What you can see there is actual brain damage. So it's just not testing for IQ or anything like that. We now have solid evidence that small amounts of pesticides in food is damaging the brains of our children before they are born. We also know while they're developing as children. Young children being breastfed, we know pesticides cross and, breast milk here in the US, when it's tested, they find Roundup in it, Glyphosate and other pesticides. We know that the poisons that are in GMO corn, for instance, and soy, they actually modify them so they make their own poisons, and these cross the placenta and cause damage. We have this science now. It's open science. It's in the peer-reviewed literature. If someone like me, I'm a farmer, I can get those papers, I can read them, and I can understand them. How come the people who are in charge of pesticide safety can't read and understand? I would call this child abuse, neglect and abuse of the worst sort. And the other thing I want to say is this. We're at a conference here on health and food. People say to me all the time, oh, organic food is so expensive. How expensive is this? What is the cost of this? What is the cost, the lifetime cost of doing damage to children? That, there is no price worth paying for this. It's unforgivable. And we need to get that across. Now, that's all the bad news. Let's end this on good news. We can't wait for governments. We can we can empower ourselves and make this change and make the difference. We have lots of scientific studies, good studies, showing that when we put children and ourselves on organic diets, that we can get these pesticides out of our bodies within days. That is incredible news. And that means, we can make a difference. And really importantly, and the reason I wrote my book, Poisoning Our Children, I wrote it particularly for moms and dads, that, if you're going to have children, start eating organic now. Get this out of your body. As parents, I always, and personally I believe out of all the things I've done in life, the most important thing, the thing I've gotten the most joy out of, is being a parent. And, we, as parents, it's our responsibility to do the best we can for our children. And giving them organic is the best way we can assure that they can have a healthy life. And not just pesticides. I can show you the studies if we start talking about antioxidants, flavonoids, particularly, when we're talking about the plant-based phenols, phenolic compounds. The research shows, on average, organic food has around 30% more than industrial food. And we know that these compounds are very good at preventing all these chronic diseases we're talking about, and very important in us curing them. So it's not just avoiding the pesticides, it's also giving them the best quality food. What we want to do, instead of giving them a lifetime of ill health, give them a lifetime of the best health. And so I would argue that organic food is the best value food you can get, because you're going to save, thousands and thousands of dollars in doctor's fees alone. But more importantly, for me, I suppose what I want to ask is, what type of civilization poisons its children? I just think that, future historians are going to look back at us and go, this must be the dumbest civilization on the planet. They've had thousands of scientific papers showing them how dangerous these things are, and yet they've ignored it and poisoned their future. That's idiocy. And what I would like to say is we can empower ourselves and turn it around and make a difference and buy organic, eat organic. And the advantage of that too is we will change farming. Reward your local organic farmers, support them. And as we grow this market, other farmers will change. We will change society. This is a revolution, and it's as simple as how we spend our dollars. Instead of giving that money to Monsanto, give it to your local organic farmer, and all of us will benefit. So thank you very much. I do have time for questions. I went out of my way to allow questions if you want that. I just want to ask, if you're recording this, are you recording the questions? How do you work? And thanks. We'll just pass the mic around. Can we get the hand mic to work, please? That sounds pretty good. Okay. Yeah, thanks, because that is a really important question and issue. And the fact is, these chemicals, where there's testing, and here in the US, the United States Geological, USGS, tests most of the rivers. And believe me, we can find glyphosate, atrazine, you name it, in nearly every watercourse. And then there's other ones like the PCBs, or what we know now as the forever chemicals, the PFAS, and I brought this along, but normally I refuse to take till receipts because these are covered in them. And virtually every watercourse in the US is contaminated with this. You should see the lists of pesticides that are found in drinking water, and that's just drinking water. So every living creature is contaminated with them and is causing effects. So one of the things we have is this complete collapse of insects. If you look at the research done in the collapse of birds here in the US, but we're seeing this around the world because these chemicals just contaminate everywhere. You know, in the 1980s, they tried to look at what was happening with chemicals in breast milk. And they went up to the Arctic to work with the indigenous women there to get breast milk. And they tested it, and they were surprised because the amount of chemicals they found in it, that the breast milk wouldn't be allowed to be sold because it'd be toxic. And you think, well, hang on, you know, these are women that live in the area where the least amount of these chemicals are used. You know, they find it in penguins in Antarctica. So we have polluted the whole planet with these chemicals, and we're affecting living organisms. We're seeing this crash of living species. And I want to talk, you know, when I talked about hormone disruption or endocrine disruption, how, you know, parts per trillion cause problems. And the part per trillion is one drop in 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water. And this is affecting the reproduction of animals around the world and plants, because apart from single-celled organisms, virtually every living organism on this planet, plants and animals, we reproduce sexually, and we have the same hormones. Estrogen and progesterone in females, testosterone in males, whether we're a plant or an animal. So we're affecting all life on this planet. And to me, this is another criminal issue, and why there's a lot of us now that want to see ecocide as a crime. I believe that if we are, thank you. I believe if we are truly Homo sapiens, a wise species, we have a duty to protect all other species instead of doing what we're doing at the moment, which is just bringing in the 6th extinction event on this planet.
For organic food in the United States, lower amount, it will be accepted better. Organic, but it's not really organic.
Yeah, look, I hear this all the time. The USDA organic system is a very good one. It's not perfect, and there are a few issues, but generally the issue to do with pesticides, it's a very good one. There is good testing, And I would argue that it's, like I say, generally speaking, the research which I've seen, including the one which I just showed ended on, is looking at USDA certified organic products in humans. And the benefits are great. Every now and then, when I've looked at some of the research, there has been a small amount of pesticide residues in organic. This is usually due not to fraud, but to spray drift from the neighbours. It's accidental. And we find that those amounts are usually 1,000 times lower than what is permitted. But it's very rare. Most organic food has no residues. So personally, I trust it. If I'm here, I would rather eat USDA certified than something that has no certification or no claim. There are some new systems that are coming out that are improving on the USDA certified. One of them is the Regenerative Organic Standard by the Rodale. And so it might be worthwhile if you to also look at those to bring organic to the next level. But still, in the scale of things, I would trust USDA Organic Certified over the alternatives. The only other alternative, which I think is very important, is if we have a CSA or a farmer's market, and we know the people who are running it, and they have good checks and balances, you can basically say that these systems are safe, are reliable. But end of the day, while certification mightn't be perfect, we need to have some sort of independent system that can give us a guarantee that something is organic. Otherwise, we open it up to all these fraudulent claims. Yeah, look, it's what's happening now with all these chemicals. A lot of them are acting as synthetic hormones, and in many cases, synthetic reproductive hormones. A lot of them act as synthetic estrogens. And this is a real issue. For instance, what we're understanding is that, for instance, we know that 80% of breast cancers are estrogen sensitive. And we also know that the chances of breast cancers increases the earlier a girl reaches puberty. What's happened now, the age of puberty in our lifetimes, for many of us here, has really decreased. Girls are becoming sexually mature much younger. And that is because of these small amounts of estrogen that they're getting as they're developing and all through their lives in their food from these estrogen chemicals. Similarly with boys, it's causing another range of problems when they shouldn't be getting these levels of estrogen. So we're seeing, as boys are developing, a whole range of urinary genital deformations, as well as issues like undescended testes. Then as they're going into puberty, increases in testicular cancers, and also very, very concerning is the fall in sperm counts. But it's not just the fall in the sperm numbers, but the quality of sperm. And this is really important for the future of our species. So, yeah, and then when we're talking about issues like gender fluidity, that is very well documented as well. And some of these pathways are well known. Very good work has been done by Dr. Tyrone Hayes, showing how one of the second most common herbicide, herbicides are chemicals that kill plants. The most common is Roundup. The second most common one is atrazine. And what that affects is the, what's called the aromatase cycle within the bodies of animals. So it essentially means that male animals now will start actually converting testosterone into estrogen at a very early age. And what you see in a lot of animals, for instance, it feminizes frogs. And this is happening all through, we know, in lots of animals. And this is also happening within humans because why? Our sexual systems, our reproductive systems, our hormone systems are identical. What happens in frogs, birds, and other animals happens to us. So these chemicals are a major issue on the reproduction of our species, but every other species on this planet. Okay, look, I thank you for asking that. I must admit I'm someone who is after all my years of dealing with governments around the world, have very little trust in governments, and also someone who's spent a lot of my life talking to governments and trying to work with them just to find governments doing their best to undermine what we're doing. They are captive to the big money and industrial complexes. The only way we get change is we do it ourselves. This is really important. Empower ourselves, and we can do it. Don't wait for government, and don't be intimidated by government. We make these decisions, and we change things. So the fact is that we can buy organic food in every store and supermarket now has got nothing to do with government. It's got to do with a consumer revolution now being concerned about what we eat. And that's what I was talking about before. Our dollar, our wallet, is the most important tool we have for change. Sorry, I've got the red buttons come up, but please, I'm around all day. You're welcome to talk to me.